Right now, somewhere in the world, a developer is writing a query in Microsoft SQL Server. It is one of the most successful database products ever made, a multi-billion-dollar pillar of Microsoft's business, running the financial systems and inventories and customer records of an enormous share of the corporate world. And the language that developer is typing, along with its fundamental architecture underneath it, was not invented by Microsoft. It was invented by a company in Berkeley, California that most people have never heard of. A company that in the late 1980s built what was arguably the most technically advanced database on the planet, that was hailed as the one company with a genuine shot at dethroning Oracle. That company then made a decision that seemed brilliant at the time and turned out to be the beginning of a slow execution. It handed its crown jewels to Microsoft voluntarily, believing it was the smartest deal it would ever make. And a few years later, Microsoft would walk away from the partnership holding a copy of the source code, and it would use that source code to build its own empire, an empire that would destroy the very company that had given Microsoft that source code in the first place. This is the story of Sybase, the story of how a company loaded a gun and handed it to its own enemy. Our story begins in 1984 with 4 people and an idea about how databases ought to work. The founders were Mark Hoffman, Bob Epstein, Jane Dougherty, and Tom Higgin. Now, Epstein's background matters enormously here because he had helped build a relational database called Ingress. It was a technically brilliant database that had lost the first great database war to Larry Ellison's Oracle, beaten by superior salesmanship rather than superior engineering. Epstein had lived through that defeat. He had watched the better product lose, and when he and his co-founder set out to build a new database company, they were carrying that lesson with them, along with an idea that would prove genuinely revolutionary. The idea was a client-server architecture, and to understand why it mattered, you have to understand how databases worked at the time. In the mid-1980s, most database systems were monolithic. Every user who connected to the database essentially started up a whole heavy copy of the thing for themselves, consuming enormous amounts of memory and computing power. Oracle worked this way. Almost every database worked this way. The Sybase founders looked at the coming world, correctly guessed that computer networks were about to become universal, and designed their database from the ground up for that world, splitting the work between a central server that held and managed the data and lightweight clients that talked to it over the network. The efficiency gains were staggering. Where a monolithic database might need megabytes of memory for every additional user connected, Sybase needed something on the order of 45 kilobytes. The resource savings were monumental. Sybase shipped its first program in late 1986 and formally released its system in May of 1987, and it arrived at precisely the right moment, because at the time, cheap and powerful Unix servers from companies like Sun Microsystems were flooding into businesses, selling at a fraction of the cost of the mainframes that ran corporate computing for decades. Suddenly, companies could buy affordable hardware, and here was a database designed specifically to squeeze extraordinary performance out of exactly that kind of machine, handling thousands of simultaneous transactions without collapsing, and one industry noticed faster than any other. That was Wall Street. Financial firms needed to process gigantic volumes of transactions instantly with absolute reliability, and Sybase could do it when almost nothing else could. Sybase took the financial sector by storm, becoming the database of choice across trading floors and banks, and on the back of that, it grew into one of the fastest rising software companies in America, the challenger everybody talked about, the company with the technical edge that might finally take the database crown away from Oracle. But there was one enormous market where Sybase had no presence at all, and that was the personal computer market. Sybase lived on Unix servers in the world of expensive machines and technical specialists. The PC was becoming the center of business computing, and every serious software company understood that whatever happened on the PC would eventually define the industry. And there was another company that had the exact opposite problem. Microsoft owned the PC operating system business, but it had no serious database technology whatsoever. Microsoft needed a real industrial strength database, and it needed one quickly. The market was growing, and it was growing fast, and Microsoft wanted to enter it as soon as possible. In 1986, Sybase agreed to license its technology to Microsoft Microsoft, an arrangement that became public in January of 1988, and out of it came a product co-developed by Sybase, Microsoft and Ashton Tate. Microsoft sold this product under its own name, calling it Microsoft SQL Server. For years, Microsoft SQL Server and Sybase's own databases were for practical purposes the same product, same code lineage, same architecture, same query language. Microsoft was, in effect, a distributor reselling Sybase technology on Microsoft's platform with a Microsoft badge on the box. At the time, everybody involved thought this was excellent, and you can see exactly why Sybase agreed to it. Sybase got instant access to the PC world it had no way of reaching on its own. It also got revenue from licensing and the enormous credibility of a partnership with the most powerful software company in the industry. Ashton Tate eventually lost interest in the joint venture and stepped away. Microsoft would wound up eventually taking over as the lead partner in this relationship, which meant that Microsoft engineers were now spending years working intimately with Sybase's source code, learning its architecture from the inside, understanding every design decision, building relationships with the customers who had used it, and slowly assembling the expertise to do all of it themselves. The agreement expired in 1993 and the relationship would come to an end. By most accounts, the divorce was messy, with the two sides at odds over how revenue should be shared. And when it ended, Microsoft did something cunning and devastating. It purchased a copy of the source code, took it in-house, and set off in its own direction. This is the part of the story I want to be precise about, because it would be easy and dramatic to describe this as a theft. Sybase was not robbed. Sybase signed the papers. Sybase took the money. Sybase, by agreeing to sell Microsoft a copy of its source code, had handed over the keys to its own kingdom in exchange for short-term profit. And by 1994, Microsoft had taken over all development and marketing of SQL Server for its own operating system, and Sybase was left facing a competitor that had been built quite literally out of Sybase's own DNA. And that competitor had every advantage that Sybase liked. Microsoft SQL Server ran on Windows NT, and Windows NT was in the process of storming into the corporate server rooms all over the world. It was priced far below the Unix database market that Sybase depended on, which meant that a company deciding how to build a new system faced a familiar Microsoft equation, where the Microsoft option was cheaper, sat inside the environment they already ran, and did most of what the expensive alternatives did. And crucially, Microsoft was not selling a copy of an imitation that could be dismissed as inferior. It was selling the same fundamental technology, matured and extended, with the full weight of Microsoft's distribution behind it. Sybase, meanwhile, was busy wounding itself. The trouble started with System 10, which arrived carrying defective code that made it genuinely difficult to use for many of the company's most important accounts. The very banks and trading floors whose loyalty was Sybase's single greatest assets were now experiencing trouble with one of their most important technologies. And the timing was catastrophic, because the market Sybase was stumbling in was exploding all around it. In 1995, Oracle's revenue grew by 42% and Informerk surged by more than 50%. Sybase, meanwhile, stayed the same. Its sales were completely flat. In fact, the company closed the year with a loss of $19.5 million. And in the middle of all of that, Sybase made the largest bet of its life on something that had nothing to do with fixing its database. In November of 1994, it announced it would acquire PowerSoft, the maker of PowerBuilder, the enormously popular tool for building client-server applications, in a stock swap valued at around $940 million. On paper, the logic was sound: own the database and own the tool that developers use to build on it. What actually happened was stranger. PowerSoft's people took over the company that had bought them. PowerSoft's co-founder rose to become chief executive of Sybase itself, and PowerSoft's former president ended up running Sybase's product. And the joke going around the industry press at the time was to ask who had really bought whom, which meant that the largest deal the software industry had ever seen had purchased Sybase, a distraction, a management upheaval, and an entire second business to worry about. This was all happening at the wrong time, because it was in exactly those years that Microsoft was consolidating its hold on the server market. Microsoft poured enormous resources into marketing and distribution of its SQL Server technology, gaining rapid market share in the database market. Meanwhile, Sybase was losing momentum, but still, Sybase still remained a genuinely excellent database with a fiercely loyal base in the financial and telecommunications industry, and it never disappeared. It simply stopped being the company company that might win the database wars and became a company that was, in a sense, slowly declining. And nothing illustrated that more than the events of 1996. In 1996, Sybase renamed its flagship product, the database it had spent a decade building. The thing the whole company was founded to create could no longer be called its original name, SQL Server, because Microsoft SQL Server had grown so dominant in the marketplace that Sybase's own customers were getting confused about which product was which. So Sybase renamed its database Adaptive Server Enterprise. The original had to change its name to avoid being mistaken for the copy. The great prize, the chance to be the defining database company of the client-server era, had gone. In May of 2010, the German software giant SAP announced it would acquire Sybase for approximately $5.8 billion. And in 2014, SAP stopped using the Sybase name altogether. The company that had built the database Wall Street ran on, that had genuinely out-engineered Oracle, that had once looked like the future of the entire industry, was now erased from the branding entirely. Now look at what became of the other half of the 1986 agreement. Microsoft SQL Server grew into one of the most widely deployed databases on earth and one of the most profitable products Microsoft has ever built, generating billions of dollars a year. The thing Sybase licensed away for access to the PC market became a pillar of the richest software company in history, and it has outlived its creator by more than a decade. So Sybase never lost a fair fight because there was never really a fight to lose. It was not out-engineered, it was not outthought. It made a rational, defensible business decision in 1986 to trade its technology for reach. It could not have known that trusting Microsoft would lead to its own demise. It had armed its own future competitor. Sybase built something so good that Microsoft is still selling it today. That is the whole tragedy, and that is the story of Sybase. Thank you for watching.